Claire Owens, a well-known math professor from Boston, had built her entire life around precision. Numbers always lined up. Her lectures at universities across Europe and North America were famous for being tough, structured, and flawlessly delivered. So when she found herself stuck in rural Alabama after a series of connecting flights were delayed by storms, her frustration was visible from the moment she stepped off the bus. She had been invited to speak at an educational conference being held in a small regional college nearby. Due to a booking error at the hotel, she was temporarily placed in a home stay, something she hadn't done since grad school, and now stood in front of a modest, ivy-covered house with old wood siding and wind chimes made from silver spoons. When the door opened, there was Miss Loretta. A warm smile, long grey braids pulled back into a scarf, and a voice so soft Claire almost didn't hear her say, "Come on in, sugar, you must be tired." The house smelled like cinnamon and beeswax. It was cozy, in a way that unsettled Claire. There were books stacked in corners, a basket of yarn beside the couch, and quilts hanging on every wall. It felt nothing like her sleek apartment back home. That night, Claire sat at the small kitchen table with her notes, preparing for her big presentation. She scribbled equations, paused, recalculated, then sighed. Across the room, Miss Loretta brewed a pot of tea and hummed softly. Without looking up, she said, "It's funny, you know. The way a skirt gathers and folds says a lot about which way the wind wants to blow." Claire raised an eyebrow but didn't respond. She thought it was just a folksy comment. Then Miss Loretta wandered over, holding a scrap of paper she'd pulled from an old notebook. "You've been on that one problem for what, an hour now?" she asked gently. Claire, defensive, replied, "It's a variation of a model I teach." "Not easy?" Miss Loretta nodded and, with that same scrap of paper, started writing. Not numbers at first, little sketches, curved lines, layered shapes. Then she added a formula, adjusted a variable, and within minutes, the answer was there. Flawless. Claire stared at it, stunned. It was right. More than right, it was elegant. Her mouth opened slightly, no sound coming out. Miss Loretta just smiled, tapped the paper and said, "Sometimes folds in fabric carry more truth than you think." Claire tried to keep her expression neutral, but her eyes betrayed her. There was no mistaking it. What just happened didn't fit into any lecture she had ever given or attended. The method Miss Loretta used wasn't listed in any journal, hadn't been presented at any math symposium, and yet it worked with a kind of quiet precision Claire couldn't ignore. It was like watching someone sew a perfect dress without ever touching a pattern. Still holding the paper, she leaned forward and asked, not unkindly, "Where did you learn this? I mean, how are you so comfortable with this kind of abstract math?" Miss Loretta didn't rush to answer. She sipped her tea, then looked out the window, her gaze drifting past the porch swing and over the field behind the house, where the early evening light flattened shadows across the grass. Her voice came soft, thoughtful. "Once," she said, "I could tell the length of a kiss just by how far the shadow moved on the ground." Claire blinked. "Sorry." "What?" Miss Loretta nodded slowly, as if it made perfect sense. "You sit still long enough, quiet enough, you start to see time not in ticks or numbers, but in how things lean, shift, come back around. The ground tells you things if you've been around long enough to understand." Claire didn't know how to respond. That wasn't an explanation, at least not in the way she was used to. Still, it stirred something odd in her, a mix of curiosity and discomfort. She recognized abstract thinking when she saw it. People trained for years in order to connect math with natural patterns that way, and yet here it was, wrapped in words, about sunlight and kissing, coming from a woman who wore knit slippers and kept peppermint leaves in a mason jar. She looked back at the paper again. The equations weren't just solved, they were shaped by something deeper, almost emotional. For a second, Claire wondered if this raw sense of time and movement had been developed not in a classroom, but in silence. Maybe in waiting for someone who didn't come back. She didn't ask. Not yet. But that feeling stuck with her. A sense that behind Miss Loretta's quiet confidence was a story full of paused moments, unfinished math, and a kind of knowing no textbook ever taught. The days at Miss Loretta's house passed with a quiet rhythm. Nothing like the tightly wound schedule Claire preferred. Still, she found herself noticing small things. At first, they seemed like coincidences, Loretta fixing the old coffee maker with a twist of wire and a glass marble using angles Claire wouldn't have thought to consider. Then it was how she arranged her books, not by title, not by author, but by patterns Claire couldn't quite understand. There was a flow, a structure. Genres mixed, but somehow the volumes connected, almost like they were equations themselves, pieces of something bigger with a logic threading them together. One afternoon, Claire watched as Loretta folded laundry in what seemed like a random order, but after a few minutes, Claire realized it wasn't random at all. Each item was folded based on size, material, layering potential, and the weight they added to the stack. It was efficiency in motion, simple yet brilliant. Loretta didn't pause to think it through or explain what she was doing. She just knew. Her mind saw the kind of patterns that people like Claire had taught in theory, but never quite lived so instinctively. Claire, normally quick with words, found herself unsure of how to ask what she wanted to know. So instead, one evening after dinner, she leaned back in her chair and said lightly, almost like a joke, "You ever want to travel with a math? Professor, I could use a translator for the conference next month. Think of it like an adventure. It's in Denver." Loretta gave her a look over the rim of her teacup. "You mean be your translator, or just help you figure out why your own math's stalling?" she asked, a grin playing at the corners of her mouth. Claire held up her hands. "Both, maybe. No pressure. Just thought it could be. Interesting." Truth was, Claire wanted to see what would happen if she placed Loretta in a space where every formula was worshipped, where credentials mattered and intuition was often dismissed. She wanted to understand her better, unpack the logic that didn't look like logic, but kept revealing itself in the smallest things. And maybe, even though she wouldn't admit it out loud, she wanted to see if a room full of experts would notice what she had started to sense, that Loretta's mind carried a different map altogether, and that it just might be more complete than any she'd read before. Loretta didn't even let Claire finish before shaking her head. "Oh no, honey," she said, standing up from the table and waving her hand like she was swatting a fly. "I don't have the patience or the knees to be chasing after other people's formulas anymore. Let the world keep spinning without me trying to catch up. I've got my porch, my tea, and enough books to keep me company." Claire had expected a no, but maybe not one so final. She nodded, said nothing more, and figured that was the end of it. She went back to reviewing her notes for the conference, but later that afternoon she noticed Loretta sitting unusually quiet in her room, something in her lap. Earlier, Claire had been searching for an extension cord and had accidentally nudged open an old cedar trunk tucked beside a stack of quilts. She hadn't thought much of it, figured it was full of old linens, but now that same trunk sat open behind Loretta, and in her hands was an old marbled notebook. The cover was faded and cracked along the edges. Inside were pages filled with neat handwriting, detailed sketches, and formulas woven in between bits of drawings and unfinished thoughts, equations carrying the rhythm of a memory rather than the cold precision of a classroom. Loretta ran her fingers over one of the pages, like she was reading without needing to see the words. Just before dinner, her granddaughter, Simone, came in from school. She was quieter than usual, backpack dragging behind her. While Claire handled the dishes, Loretta noticed Simone sitting alone on the porch steps, wiping at her face with the sleeve of her hoodie. "Something wrong, baby?" she asked gently, easing onto the step beside her. Simone shrugged but didn't speak. After a few moments, her voice came out low. I didn't want to say anything, but I'm tired. They laugh when I talk about science. Say it's weird for a black girl to care about this stuff. My teacher even told me to focus on things that come natural. For a long moment, Loretta didn't say a word. Then she got up, not rushing, and returned with the notebook. She placed it in Simone's lap. Her eyes looked sharper now, but filled with something deeper, resolve, maybe. As Simone flipped through the pages, Loretta whispered, "No one decides what's natural for you but you." And just like that, something long asleep stirred back to life. The luggage sat by the door 3 days before the trip. Claire had packed light, presentation slides, a blazer, her worn leather planner. Loretta, though she claimed she wasn't going to participate, checked her small suitcase twice. She kept saying it was just to keep Simone company or to sit in the back and listen. But Claire noticed how carefully she folded the old notebook into a tote bag and placed pens beside it, like someone gearing up for something more than just watching. Simone couldn't sleep the night before their flight. She bounced quietly between the kitchen and the porch, full of questions she didn't always say out loud. Loretta watched her with a kind of calm that Claire didn't yet fully understand. It wasn't the usual parental concern. This was deeper, like she was trying to guide Simone toward something she'd once turned away from herself. She didn't push her granddaughter to like math. She simply made space for her to see it differently. Claire, who'd spent her entire academic career surrounded by corrected problem sets and admission rates, had never thought much about the personal side of learning. Students came and went, numbers on an application form, test scores on a spreadsheet. But watching Loretta's quiet focus, how she tied her own decision to go not to ambition, but to a promise, for Simone, it started to shift something in Claire. They sat around the kitchen table the morning of the flight, sipping coffee. The kind of silence that comes not from awkwardness, but from 1,000 thoughts being weighed all at once. Claire finally asked, "You sure you don't want to present something? You could." Loretta shook her head gently. "I'm not going to stand up there in front of strangers and prove anything. That part of life's behind me. What I do want is for Simone to sit in a room where nobody's laughing at how her brain works. I want her to see black and brilliant in the same sentence, out loud, where folks can't ignore it." Claire nodded. She didn't have a reply to that, but deep down, she was beginning to realize that all the logic in the world had limits. Some things, love, protection, the fire someone lights for the next generation, couldn't be graphed. They just had to be witnessed. And maybe, for the first time, Claire was ready to do that. When they landed in Denver, everything felt sharper, colder air, faster footsteps, tighter smiles. The conference center towered over a plaza filled with metallic sculptures and hurried professionals, each with name tags swinging and coffee cups clutched tightly. Claire moved through it with ease, nodding to colleagues and giving quick updates about her panel. Simone, wide-eyed, tried to absorb it all. Loretta, dressed in her usual relaxed clothes and bright scarf, walked at her own pace, letting the crowd move around her like water around a rock. The first strange look came before breakfast. Someone mistook Loretta for a hotel housekeeper and asked for extra towels. Claire began to correct the woman, but Loretta just gave a half smile and walked on. Later, a man asked if she was there for one of the storytelling workshops for seniors. Another called her sweet and asked if she was someone's grandmother tagging along. Through it all, Loretta kept her focus. She was used to being underestimated. She slipped quietly into the open public sessions, sitting in the back, blending in, unnoticed. It wasn't until the second day that people started paying attention for the right reason. During one of the youth logic workshops, Simone was struggling with a puzzle meant to simulate environmental balance using ratios, weights, and rotational logic. Claire sat beside her, offering formulas and diagrams. Loretta, who happened to be walking past the table, paused for a second and leaned in. "You're thinking like a faucet, but this is more like tide water," she said, calmly. Then, using a paper napkin and a coin, she shifted the frame of the problem, comparing the weights to the way tide rhythms pull in and retreat. It worked. It clicked, not just for Simone, but for two other teenagers standing nearby. They started asking questions. Loretta answered them with comparisons to everything from braided lace patterns to gumbo recipes. The examples weren't random. They carried deep structure, math hidden in tradition, logic flowing under language. By the end of the session, a small crowd had formed. Students from Japan, Brazil, and Canada stayed after, leaning in as Loretta explained probability through fishing nets and baking measurements. It wasn't just clever, it was intuitive. It made sense in a way the whiteboards didn't. Claire stood off to the side then, watching. For once, she didn't need to speak. Loretta was finally in the room, and the room had started to change. The clip was just over 2 minutes long. Simone had recorded it on her phone without much thought, just her grandma, sitting cross-legged on the carpeted floor of the youth lounge, using a set of colored seashells and an empty coffee cup to explain the rhythm of quadratic equations. A small group of students sat around her, laughing and nodding along, totally locked in. At one point, Loretta used a soft drum beat, one borrowed from an old samba rhythm, to explain how variables shift within a predictable tempo. No slides, no chalkboard, just shells, sound, and simple words that somehow made something complicated feel clear. Simone posted the video that night, adding a short caption, "My grandma teaches math like it's music. From New Orleans to Denver, this is how we learn." She didn't expect anything to come of it, maybe. A few likes from her classmates back home. But by morning, the video had taken off. It spread fast, across Twitter, then TikTok, picked up by education blogs and even a major news site. Thousands of people shared it, calling Loretta a genius, a natural, a game changer. Some wrote whole threads about cultural math and learning, outside traditional methods. Her accent, her ease, her rhythm, they weren't just part of her teaching style. They were the lesson itself. In the middle of it all, Claire watched with a mix of surprise and quiet pride. But not everyone at the conference shared that feeling. Alfred Chambers had been in the academic math world longer than anyone cared to count. He was respected, feared in some circles, a man obsessed with control over how knowledge was presented and who got to present it. He and Claire had run in the same circles years ago, often standing on opposite sides of arguments about science outreach and what counted as real teaching. He saw the video on the second day and didn't smile once. By the time Loretta entered the panel room for the next student session, Chambers was already there, stiff in his suit, arms crossed, watching. His eyes followed her through every workshop, every break session, and even through lunch, as if trying to pin down what she was doing, that had students skipping other events just to listen to her. He never said a word to her, not yet, but Claire could feel the storm starting. Loretta, unbothered as ever, just handed a kid a smooth shell and asked him if he knew what it felt like to count waves. The fourth day of the conference started. Like the others, with a blur of sessions, panel discussions, and hallway chatter, Simone had been hopeful. She'd been preparing for the Youth Logic Challenge all week, working alongside Claire in the evenings and absorbing bits of advice from Loretta whenever she could. Her confidence had grown, not from points or rankings, but from feeling seen and respected in a way she never had back home. But that morning, as the finalists were being confirmed, an announcement came through quietly. Too quietly at first. A printed list was slid under the door of the prep room. Simone's name was missing. At first, she thought it was a mistake, but then one of the coordinators approached and explained with an apologetic voice that a rule had been triggered. To qualify, all participants had to submit official proof of previous participation in a nationally recognized competition. Simone had none. Her application had been initially accepted in error, and now, with the final round hours away, she was disqualified. She said nothing at first, just walked into a side corner, sat down, and stared at the palms of her hands. Claire tried to reach her, but Simone only shook her head. "I knew it," she muttered. "I don't belong here. This isn't our place. I shouldn't have come." Loretta stood there quietly, her hands gripping the strap of her tote bag. Her mouth tightened, but she said nothing right away. Instead, she stepped outside and took a long breath. By the time she came back in, her mind was made up. Without saying a word to anyone, she made her way to the advanced workshop room, where only registered researchers were scheduled to present and discuss open mathematical problems. She walked in and took a seat. A few people looked up, confused. One organizer approached her, tried to explain the space was for contributors only. Loretta nodded and said, "I'm not here to win anything. I just want to put something on the table." Someone asked if she had credentials. She said no. Then she unfolded her notebook, laid it across the table, and began explaining a pattern she had found years ago, using patchwork fractions, how it mapped perfectly onto a sequence taught in applied statistics. She didn't use jargon. She didn't need to. The clarity was in the message. Still, not everyone was happy with her bold move, and the room quickly divided, those seeing a threat and those seeing a light they hadn't known to look for. The Tees ballroom at the downtown Denver Arts Center was all sharp edges and soft lighting, filled with round tables draped in white and more forks than anyone really needed. The benefit dinner, hosted by the National Association for Access and Innovation in STEM, was one of those polished events where academics and donors mingled over salmon and speeches. Claire had brought Simone and Loretta as guests, though she wasn't sure how comfortable either of them would feel in a room like that. Already, a few awkward introductions had passed. Someone had called Loretta Professor Thompson by mistake, and rather than correcting them, she just smiled and sipped her tea. Simone sat quietly beside her, still feeling the sting of what had happened at the workshop earlier that day. Claire tried to steer conversation towards safe topics, but the tension under the surface remained. Halfway through the meal, one of the organizers from the STEM Association leaned over and spoke softly to Loretta. "You've made quite an impression this week. Would you like to say a few words before dessert?" Loretta blinked, then nodded once. No fuss, no big sigh. She just stood slowly and walked toward the open mic at the center of the room. At first, the chatter in the room barely stopped, but Loretta didn't rush. She thanked the hosts, then told a short story about her mother's cracked clay pots, how they were passed down through the family because they still worked, even with cracks. "We didn't always have the newest pans," she said calmly, "but if you placed the old clay ones over a steady flame and gave them enough time, they boiled just like any other. Maybe slower, maybe with a little whistling sound on the edges, but they got the job done." Then she looked around the room and added, "Some of us are like that. Might not look right for this setting, might carry a few cracks, but we still got heat in us." The room went still. Then came the clapping, slow at first, then building. People stood. Not everyone, but enough. Simone clapped the hardest. Claire stayed quiet for a moment, her throat tight, then joined in. Later, as they stood waiting for their coats, Claire turned to Loretta. "I've spent my whole career chasing perfect equations," she said. "But tonight, you taught me something better. How to show up, cracks and all." A couple of days after the conference winded down, with most attendees already flying back to their universities and offices across the country, Loretta asked Claire for a quiet afternoon. She didn't say why, just that she wanted to visit. a place nearby that she had read about on the community board at the Civic Center. Claire offered to drive, and Simone tagged along, curious more than anything else. They pulled into a small senior living home on the edge of the city. It wasn't glamorous, plain brick walls, a trimmed front lawn, but it had a cozy charm. Inside, sunlight poured through wide windows, and the living room smelled of old books and warm coffee. They were greeted by a staff member who led them to the activity room. It was there, among puzzles and polished tables, that Loretta spotted her. An older woman, elegant despite the thick grey braid wrapped around her head like a crown, sat near the window, carefully sketching a series of curved lines into a notebook. Loretta froze mid-step, her hand tightening slightly around the strap of her tote bag. On the table beside the woman lay an old pair of dancing slippers and, oddly, a worn brass compass, its edges smoothed from decades of use. Their eyes met. The woman blinked, leaned forward, and whispered, "Loretta King." Loretta's jaw dropped. Elise Moreau, once a ballerina with the Chicago Dance Company, once a student at the same small women's college in Louisiana where Loretta had studied math, smiled wide. "I remember those hands," she said, pointing at Loretta's fingers, now picking up the compass. "You always carried that thing, even during breaks, twisting it like a baton. You said dance had symmetry, and you were going to prove it using geometry and rhythm." Loretta laughed. Really laughed, deeper than she had in days. They talked for over an hour, slipping between the past and present. Elise reminded her of nights when Loretta hummed softly to herself in the dorm, turning problems into melodies, folding movement into numbers. The memory hit like a warm wave. That spark, the one Loretta thought had dimmed long ago, returned, flickering steady in her chest. In Elise's eyes, glowing with recognition and joy, Loretta saw something familiar. Not just the past, but a version of herself that still lived, still mattered, and still had more to give. The calm after the conference didn't last long. Word of Loretta's quiet rise, her impromptu workshops, and that dinner speech had reached communities far beyond the hotel walls. Videos kept spreading. Students from different states messaged Simone, thanking her for sharing the first clip. It wasn't just about math anymore. It was about who got to stand at the board, who got to explain, and who was allowed to be heard. Not everyone enjoyed the shift. Alfred Chambers, already gritting his teeth from being overshadowed during the last few sessions, decided he'd had enough. During a final panel on educational equity, with the audience packed into the main room and live streams running online, he did something no one expected. He stood up after a segment about alternative teaching methods and turned toward Loretta, who was sitting quietly in the second row, sketching a diagram in her notebook. "I wonder," he said loudly, drawing the crowd's attention, "if reciting folk wisdom and charming metaphors is enough to face actual math, real math, proven math." Murmurs spread through the audience like ripples. Loretta didn't flinch. Chambers stepped forward, scribbled a long equation on the board behind him, a functional analysis problem known among specialists as nearly impossible, left unsolved for more than 4 decades. "I'd like to see you take a crack at this," he said, "unless, of course, you'd rather stick to cooking analogies." Silence. Loretta stood slowly, smoothed her skirt, and walked up to the stage. She turned to the moderator and asked quietly for a piece of chalk and a fresh sheet of paper. Then, facing the board, she paused. "I'm not here for applause or to prove anything," she said plainly, "but if you're going to write someone off, you should at least give them the chalk." Without rushing, she began laying out her thinking. Small, neat steps. She didn't claim to have the full solution, but she unraveled a small piece of the problem using an approach nobody in the room had seen before. She talked through limits the way she talked about ocean tides, folding variables, like fabric seams, Her method didn't rely on memorized formulas, but on patterns she noticed from experience, things Chambers had never considered. By the end, even he had stopped frowning, because the impossible didn't look as impossible anymore. The applause rolled through the auditorium like a sudden wave, long, steady, not just polite but real, coming from deep places. Loretta stepped back from the board, eyes low, calmly dusting her hands together, chalk still clinging to her palms. She didn't grin or bow or soak it in. She just nodded once and quietly returned to her seat. But even as the room buzzed with energy, not everyone clapped. A few judges near the stage kept their expressions neutral, whispering among themselves, their eyes on one another, not on her. After a few minutes, one of them raised the issue, careful in tone but clear in message. "Yes, impressive demonstration," he began, "but we must remember she was not a registered contender. Any formal recognition would be outside conference policy." Others around him nodded, more protocol talk, more, "We appreciate her contribution, but we must respect the rules." Some even questioned whether allowing her to speak had set a risky precedent. That's when Claire stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the floor, startling even those on the panel. She didn't ask for the mic. She didn't need one. Her voice carried loud enough. "I've been quiet long enough," she said. "Everyone here knows I helped organize part of this conference. And yes, I know the rules. But I also know when rules are used to keep people out." The room got very still. Claire went on, her voice shaking but steady enough. "I used to think that if I worked harder than anyone, published more, climbed that ladder, I'd be safe from all this. I told myself I was building something worthwhile. But truth is, I've spent most of my career doubting if any of it mattered, because the achievements, degrees, awards, titles, they don't mean much if there's no one around to hold the other end of them." She stopped for a second, eyes fixed on the floor. Then she added quietly, "I lost a daughter. Her name was Maya. She loved puzzles and music and never once saw a place for herself in this field. My silence didn't help her." Claire turned toward Loretta and said, "But you taught me how much I still have to learn." No one spoke for several long seconds. Then slowly, almost cautiously, some of the judges unclenched their arms. A few nodded. The conversation had shifted, not by debate, but by someone finally telling the truth. The tension from the night before had mostly settled by morning. People still talked about what had happened, about the challenge, the argument, Claire's emotional stand, but the tone had changed. Loretta hadn't just impressed them. She had reminded everyone in that building why they'd gotten into this field in the first place. Not to chase titles, but to explore, to share, and maybe to change how others see the world. That final day of the conference was quieter. Most of the formal sessions had wrapped up, a few scattered presentations and coffee chats filling the schedule. Loretta, though, had one more thing to do. She didn't tell many people, just quietly reserved a small corner room, nothing fancy, barely a dozen folding chairs and a whiteboard in the corner. Instead of equations or graphs, she brought in hand drums, baskets of colored fabric, and loose pages filled with hand-drawn shapes. Simone helped her set up while Claire stood by the door, watching with curiosity and a bit of pride. By the time the workshop started, the room was fuller than expected. Young students, mostly from underfunded high schools, found their way in. A few researchers who'd heard about it over breakfast peeked inside. Some expected a quick, light-hearted demo. Instead, they were pulled into something unexpectedly whole. Loretta stood at the front and began with rhythm. "Geometry came before paper," she said with a smile. "Long before pens and boards, people danced in patterns. They cooked in circles. They laid out cloth in lines that bent with purpose." With that, she clapped out a beat. Simone followed, drumming softly. Then came the cloth. Bright reds and blues folded into triangles, stretched into squares, flipped and spun with dancers' steps. While they moved, Loretta broke down how symmetry worked, how angles repeated in rhythm, how dance could reveal equations just hidden enough to be felt before seen. At first, some of the older attendees had stiff expressions, eyebrows slightly raised. But as the younger ones laughed and leaned in, as shapes and movements started making sense together, something shifted. A professor from Oregon joined the clapping. A doctoral student from New York took notes between drum circles. What had started as an optional session turned into a celebration. Science and art no longer lived on opposite ends, and for perhaps the first time, cultural intuition wasn't treated as a detour, but as another way in. By the time the sun began to dip behind the skyline, the mood across the university campus had shifted from formal to festive. The cultural stage, set up near the science building's courtyard, had slowly filled with sounds of drums, laughter, and half-eaten food truck meals, held in one hand while the other kept rhythm on legs, tables, anything that made a beat. It was the final evening of the conference, and no one really seemed in a hurry to leave. Someone brought out a guitar. Another person pulled speakers from a backpack. Soon enough, a roda de samba began to take shape. Most people stood around clapping while two brave volunteers tested their dancing skills in the center. Loretta sat near the front, her legs crossed, her sandals tapping along. Her bright cotton dress moved with every note, and she looked as relaxed as she had the whole week. It was Simone who encouraged her first. "Come on, Miss Loretta," she said, nudging her gently. "If this week proved anything, it's that the stage belongs to you now." Loretta grinned. At first, she only stepped up with hands raised in rhythm. But then someone handed her the mic, and without waiting for permission, she began to sing. The verses came slowly, in a cadence calm and clear, half-sung, half-spoken lines that swayed between soft melody and winding rhyme. The crowd smiled at the beauty of her words, but then she paused and looked straight ahead. "You didn't catch it, did you?" she said with a laugh. "Let's try that again." She went back and repeated a line, this time a little slower. "Some say love is x squared plus 8x plus 16, she sang, tapping the beat with her hand. "But when I factor it, I find the root just x plus 4 squared, neat and clean." A ripple spread through the audience, first a murmur, then wide eyes. Someone gasped audibly. What they had thought was just poetry carried equations, transformations hidden under rhythm and rhyme. She had turned algebra into samba, and no one had even seen it coming. Loretta kept going, looping square roots into harmonies, folding sums into choruses. Her body moved like she'd done this forever. In that moment, math wasn't on a board or trapped in a book. It danced through her, alive and joyful. By the end, math had become music, and everyone there had felt it. By the last evening of the conference, the buzz had settled into something softer, like a slow exhale after days of intensity. People gathered indoors as clouds rolled in over the city skyline, thick and heavy with summer rain. Inside the student center, a group of teens was rehearsing for the final performance. Spoken word, music, and dance stitched together to reflect everything they'd learned. Then, without warning, the storm hit. It started with a loud crack, followed by total darkness. The lights went out with a hum and a flicker. Fans stopped spinning. Microphones went dead. A wave of confusion swept the room. People bumped into each other. Chairs scraped. Someone dropped their phone. A few of the students began to panic. Someone shouted for help from the back, while others clustered near the doors, waiting for someone else to fix it. Loretta, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, watching the rehearsals with her usual calm, stood up. She didn't shout or wave her arms. She just walked to the side table, reached under her bag, and pulled out 2 small lanterns. Simone helped her switch them on. The soft yellow light cut through the gloom, just enough to stop the anxious rushing. "Let's finish what we started," Loretta said. She moved through the room with ease, placing the lights one by one near the windows and exits. She pushed tables into a circle, brought paper and pencils from her tote, and gently handed them out. "If the mics are down," she smiled, "we'll write louder." Within minutes, the chaos settled into quiet focus. Some students began scribbling verses by hand. Others tapped out rhythms on tabletops. Loretta encouraged them to adjust their routines, to step, clap, and speak their parts without needing speakers or lighting cues. A few adults from the planning committee, standing outside the room, unsure what to do, peeked in through the crack of a side door. What they saw wasn't a breakdown, it was leadership. Not loud or flashy, just steady. Loretta, moving from table to table, listening more than she talked, helping, always helping. Later that night, someone from the committee jotted a note. "Into the final report. Demonstrated critical thinking, patience, and resourcefulness under pressure, led with quiet confidence." No one had expected her to lead, especially not in the dark. But for Loretta, whose whole life had been about making something out of almost nothing, the storm felt oddly familiar. The final morning of the conference was sunny, as if the storm had never happened. People trickled into the main hall, dressed, a little sharper than usual, the air filled with that formal kind of tension that comes before award ceremonies. String lights wrapped around the balconies, and a small jazz trio played faint melodies while folks found their seats. Everyone knew how these things usually went. Names would be called, handshakes exchanged, cameras flashed, and then it would be over. Loretta sat near the back, relaxed, chatting quietly with Simone and a few of the students who'd stayed up late with her during the blackout. Claire sat one row ahead, her arms folded, her whole posture alert, like someone bracing for something that might not come. On stage, the announcers ran through the list: big grants, team awards, recognitions for academic papers, mentorship honors. The crowd clapped along politely. When each category was wrapped up, people started shifting in their seats, thinking it was time to stand for goodbye speeches. But then the host paused. "There is," she said with a small smile. "One more." The lights on the stage adjusted slightly. A staff member brought out a small new trophy, not listed in the printed program. Its base carved from light oak with a bronze flame curled at the top. This year, the International Committee chose to create a new recognition, the host continued, not for traditional milestones, but for someone who quietly shifted the ground we all stand on, someone who reminded us that learning doesn't always follow the usual path. The room stilled. "We're calling it the Renassa Prize," she said, "for those who choose to return, to rebuild, and to share knowledge shaped by experience rather than credentials." Then came the name, Loretta Thomas. For a second, she didn't move. The sound came before her tears, the rhythm of hands drumming on chairs, then feet stomping softly, the students' version of applause when mix and amps fail. And then cheers, loud ones. She stood slowly, touched by Claire's hand on her shoulder, then made her way to the stage. Not with pride, exactly, but with something deeper, like someone who never expected to be seen, but knew exactly why she came. She didn't make a speech, but when she held the trophy, everyone could feel it. Something real, something earned, not for performance, but for presence. Back home in Charleston, South Carolina, Loretta's place didn't look much different from the street. Same weathered porch swing, same potted plants she always forgot to water, but anyone who stepped inside could feel it right away. Something had changed, not in a flashy way, but in that quiet kind of shift that sticks. The living room, once just a space for family photos and old books, now held a few folding chairs, a dry erase board, and a lamp aimed toward the couch where her students connected with people across continents on well-used laptops. It started with a few curious kids from the neighborhood. Simone had brought her younger cousins over to ask about dance patterns and ended up staying for a talk on angles and rhythm. Later, someone from Kenya joined online to share how they used geometry in farming. A girl from New Mexico beamed in to talk about indigenous weaving patterns and math. One day, there were 7 people. The next week, there were 12. Pretty soon, it had turned into a full circle, growing by word of mouth. Claire didn't move to Charleston, but she visited often, usually for a few days at a time. She brought equipment Loretta couldn't afford herself, helped with grant forms, and sometimes just sat in on classes, quietly, supporting from the corner. When the tech acted up, it was usually Claire who stepped in to sort it out. She never tried to lead. She knew this was Loretta's space now. Simone, meanwhile, had grown into her own. After months of shadowing Loretta, she started teaching small sessions herself. At first, they were more like storytelling circles, mixing music and history. But soon, they turned into full lessons, with questions, answers, and the confidence that took time to build. Loretta called it teaching from the inside out. Simone just called it real. The 3 of them couldn't have planned it any better, though they hadn't exactly sat down and mapped it out. It just happened. The retired janitor turned online teacher, the researcher who found purpose off campus, and the student who turned roots into roots. Together, they built a different kind of classroom. Loretta always laughed when new people asked about her credentials. She'd point gently to the porch, where past met present, and say, "Out here, we teach what we live." And somehow, that seemed to make perfect sense. Most mornings, Loretta would be up before the sun, setting a kettle on the stove while humming old hymns she never quite finished. The porch would still be cool, dew on the banister, city sounds far off. By the time students started arriving, some in person, others clicking into the session from tablet screens propped up on chairs or books, she already had the gourd pieces laid out, jars of dried beans ready, and a long piece of yarn stretched across the floor, looping around books to mark different lengths. The lessons didn't follow a strict plan. On one day, they'd measure recipe proportions while making cornbread in the cast-iron skillet. On another, they'd clap to live drum beats and calculate the rhythm in fractions. A string of crochet laid out on the ground turned into a number, a line. A drawing in the dirt, just a stick and some patient hands, could become a full lesson on area or balance. She blended whatever she had with the concepts that needed teaching. Loretta said learning should be felt before it's named. More than once, a visitor from a big school would sit in and expect something informal, only to walk away, needing to rethink everything they thought they knew about pedagogy. Soon, word traveled. A few of her local sessions were filmed and shared online by Simone, and it wasn't long before they got picked up by bigger circles. Professors from Penn State emailed, asking questions. A video clip even made its way into a seminar at the University of Michigan, where students were analyzing how culturally rooted education influenced outcomes in underserved communities. Then came the offer. One afternoon, Loretta got an email from the National Civic Learning Initiative. The foundation wanted to host a series of online courses based on her methods, officially recognized for continuing education credits. They promised access to a wide community and a large platform. Simone was excited. Claire said it was a big step. Loretta just leaned back in her chair. She sent a reply 2 days later, kind, polite, but crystal clear. "I'll be happy to share what I know," she wrote, "but not if I have to take the swing out of my rhythm or swap out the red thread for grey. If it's not me, drums, spices, colors and all, then it's just another math class." They agreed, because by then everyone knew. What made Loretta's teaching powerful wasn't just the content, it was the way it moved, sang, tasted, and stayed rooted. One warm Saturday afternoon, the three of them found themselves gathered around Loretta's old kitchen table. The windows were cracked open, letting in a breeze that carried the smell of the ocean mixed with something frying on the stove. Probably Simone's latest attempt at dumplings with hot sauce, a recipe she swore she improved every time. The table was cluttered with notebooks, coffee mugs, and a plate of sliced mango. Loretta sat with her hands wrapped around a chipped mug, quietly watching as Claire scribbled something on a napkin, a formula half-finished, and then crossed out again. Claire wasn't used to letting things sit unsolved. She had spent years in research, in libraries, around people who prized quick answers and clean arguments, but here she was different, softer, slower in a way that felt cautious and grateful. She looked up suddenly, as if catching herself in a rare moment, and then reached out. She took Loretta's hand with both of hers and laughed just a little. "In all my years," she said, slipping back into the gentle rhythm of her French-Canadian accent, "I don't think I've ever learned this much without opening a book." Simone looked over, half smiling, half surprised. It wasn't like Claire to say things like that out loud. Loretta just tilted her head slightly, that same half smile that spoke more than words ever could, as if responding to something deeper than what was said. She gave Claire's hand a squeeze and finally answered in her slow, carefully chosen words. "Sometimes," she said, not looking up, "a good answer don't come from logic. It comes from whatever we lived through before having the guts to ask the question." The kitchen went quiet for a moment, but not the kind of quiet that's empty. It was rich, like something had landed and settled. Simone looked toward the sound of waves crashing faintly in the distance. Loretta's house wasn't far from the shore. If you stood on the porch and listened long enough, you could catch the tide moving in and out. It made sense that their lessons ended here, where numbers met stories, where rhythm beat beside theory. They stayed a while longer, talking, not talking, letting that shared space bloom. Out there, where equations and histories met, the learning never really stopped. The morning sun rose slowly over Charleston, casting a soft gold across the marsh and spilling light over the quiet neighborhood. Through the trees, the waves of the Atlantic shimmered like a sheet being pulled gently across the horizon. On Loretta's porch, just as always, the day had already begun. There were voices, young ones. Some laughed, some spoke in half-whispers, repeating numbers and checking their notes. A few shifted chairs, arranging them in a loose circle. One girl hummed a familiar tune, her voice light as she merged the beat of a gospel song into a math pattern. 3-4 time is just grouping. Threes, she sang softly. On the porch steps, an older boy showed someone how to fold a piece of string into symmetrical shapes, explaining geometry through knots. Inside the house, the door stayed open. The screen bounced a little as people moved in and out. A chalkboard had been dragged out beside the window, already filled with symbols and scribbled notes from the night before. Simone was helping someone adjust their laptop webcam, while Claire set up an internet hotspot on the side table. Loretta stepped out last, a worn notebook in one hand, cradling a mug in the other. She didn't say much at first. She watched. The porch buzzed with movement and conversation, but none of it felt rushed. Everybody knew their role. She eased into her chair in the corner, the spot where the view let her see everything without needing to be at the center of it all. From above, if someone had been watching from the sky, or maybe even a camera moving slowly outward, they might see it all folding in place. A small house, aging but warm, at the edge of a neighborhood where roots ran deep. A porch full of chairs and ideas and stories, open laptops connecting cities and towns miles apart, and Loretta, calm as ever, guiding it all, not with big speeches, but with steady rhythm. Her way wasn't loud. It didn't wear a suit or need permission, but it worked. Turns out the world had started to understand something Loretta had lived all along. Genius doesn't always look like a lab coat or a textbook. Sometimes it wears socks on a porch and teaches algorithms with beans and songs. And sometimes it walks barefoot through the world, leaving knowledge behind like a trail.